Namaste. All right, welcome you all. Satchamayi has been dysfunctional today.
He's got me on camera. All right, Tom. Well, it's really nice to be back. It is really nice to be back. The weather here is so wonderful.
Yeah.
Not anything against the East Coast, guys. We had a great time. Thank you so much for the hosting. It was very, very remarkable time. But it is always good to go home.
We were really well hosted. People took care of us. It was it went easeful that way. And although I have expressed some trepidation about going to the East Coast, this time it was relaxed quite a bit, actually. There was really a wonderful receptivity and maturing going on in the group. And it wasn't 90 degrees as it has been the last previous two times, which those of you who live in high humidity know what that feels like.
Well, we were hosted first by CC Finns, who is now Kali Ma, for those of you who may not have heard it, and then by Anita Suze, and Radha, who hosted Brahmananda. So we really appreciate that, and it just felt very warm and loving. So thank you.
All right, so I'm feeling to speak about continuing in my revelations of parts of the Gita, expanding on different aspects of it. It's I heard a phrase today that said, God didn't create the world, God is the world. And I think that is pointing to what I am saying, is that God is us. God is nature. God is the wind and the water. It's the earth and the air. God is the all-pervading principle, which allows us to exist, to know, to be self-aware, to have choice. So that principle that we call God is no farther away than our nose, and even that's too far away. Learning to be able to perceive God is also the ability to perceive yourself. So it's a self-evident truth. But you don't come to a self-evident truth unless you can stand in a place other than that place of self-evidence. What is self-evident? We don't notice. We're noticing the air in the room. It's just operating. It's taken for granted. It's ubiquitous until you can't breathe, or you're in water, or in outer space, and you realize you've been held all along. But it's only when we become separate from God that we can know God. And in fact, can God know himself or herself? Dropping both those qualifiers. So the unfolding of the spiritual path, there are stages as we grow fatigued in our endless journey of embodiment, from being a father, a mother, a child, to being successful or a failure, being an addict or being a preacher. It is this endless movement through the many, many possibilities of life that eventually wears down the part of the God in us that stays so hooked in to its creation as us. The God in us is the one who suffers. The God in us is the one that becomes free. The God in us is the one that knows the difference. So if you're ever wondering who you are, there's your answer. But the nature of being able to make this visceral, real, not just a lovely little quote from one of the apostles of Jesus, but to something where the reality of what we're speaking of is something you can not only wake up to, but recognize what you're waking up to rather than just what you're waking up from. Obviously, we're waking up from being the creation, being the programming, being the conditioning that we all inherited when we become part of the creation again, as we travel between lives, immersing ourselves into the density of matter, of the elements, of the higher and lower nature that every human system carries. And we don't actually have much choice. Most of what's happening in our, especially in our early life, is a catching up and re-entry into what it means to be a person in the world, or God lost in the personality we're becoming. So in the Gita, we're describing a process that starts from suffering, starts from where we experience the consequence or the price or the pain of our bondage. That's actually the beginning of the end of God's infatuation or complete absorption in us. And it becomes so painful to be us, it finally breaks out in its pure form and gets relief. It's like a bad dream you can't wake up from. You're trying to move, but you can't move in the dream. The worst thing is happening or coming at you. And then suddenly the next thing you know, you're moving in your bed and you're thrashing about. Well, it's kind of like that with awakening. We come out of an absorption that we didn't know we were in. And that's at that moment we know we were dreaming. At that moment we know we are asleep or in some dream. Much of human life, waking life, is dreaming. Kind of varying degrees of being more sensory based or more mental based or more emotional based. So there is this dream-like quality, even though we're habituated to call it real. And certain moments of it, of course, truly are real. Any moment of now is real, even if it's a human now. A great movie, a good meal, good companionship, a moment in nature, the birth of a child, the death of an enemy. We kind of come into existence. I always got to throw in a little wrench. I can't just let the flow go smoothly down the Sotwick curve, which leaves you in some kind of happy, idyllic little Garden of Eden. I just can't help myself. So by the time we get to the 6th chapter, we have, you could say, the person of us, God identified with the content of ourselves, begins to move into relationship with God itself, with that principle of what we're calling God right now that lives us. And that's right there. And what's so wonderful about it is something starts happening between the piece of the creation and that God principle. And where does it happen? It happens to both. The who and the what start moving into relationship with each other. God and the person start moving into relationship with each other. And this brings the deepening that the 6th chapter points to, where the nervous system and the habit of the body itself and of the emotional nature, the vital nature, and the mental nature begin to respond to this God principle and it starts relaxing the stress of its separation from that God principle. It begins to ease into a more easeful relationship with existence. This is called sabha in the Vedic tradition, where we begin to let go of our tamas and rajas, which both keep us separate, into a more spontaneous and natural relationship with that principle that's unfolding in us. So it is a relationship. Even in the stage of the 6th chapter where you may be a pure awareness being, don't believe in God or supreme being or anything, just, happy, agnostic. This is just, I'm doing this and this is what I'm doing and it's my practices and it's my teachings and this is what I believe is happening. The ego could still be in there, but they're still in meditation. This true connection to at least that aspect of the Godhood. The deepening of this relationship starts increasing the more we pay attention to it. It's very simple. Who's in charge of the intention, where we put our attention and our choice, is this curious mix between the Godhood and the humanhood. It's the human who's willing to let go of the other things it could be doing, the other things that had made important previously, and choose to make this relationship with God, the more important activity, the more important place to put its attention. So in that way, there's a mingling, a commingling, that the God in the person and the God that is free start collaborating in this way. And the way we collaborate comes from the God in the person. God himself has no action except through his unwitting identification as us. This is why it's our responsibility to play a part, especially in the unfolding of this relationship, which we awaken to, and over the course of the Gita, we're shown how to collaborate with it. The yoga, the aligning of our life, pulling ourselves back from the error of the actions and the error of the inclinations of our mind and vital and physical, and start focusing and holding, gathering the quality of our intentionality, our purposefulness, our sense of what's true and real. All of those are intermingled, by the way. What's true and real, what's purposeful, and this gathering of ourselves are all related. We begin to organize purposely. And this organizing principle is also what allows us to keep expanding our relationship. It allows us to put the time aside. It allows us to be able to let go and relax into that unfolding of that sattvic field that we're now moving into. Even if in this point, at the point of the 6th chapter, there may not be any sense of God. There may not be any sense of anything outside of yourself. Certainly in religion, there's a lot that occurs about the God above in whatever tradition. So, and it makes God separate from us, and that's its fundamental error. But it also speaks of becoming worthy or receptive of God's love as if God's doing it. But what it misses out is that we're the ones who are doing it. What it loses is that it's not making it really clear. In our own experience, we rather would retreat into our mental understanding of the teachings. We'll retreat into making important the beliefs. We will talk about those as arguments for why things are in existence. So there's too much content in religion for this to be a natural way of the unfolding of the God within us. but it does prepare us. It prepares us to let go of the tamas and rajas tendencies that come with nature and enhance the sattvic tendencies that come in nature. And I see, that's why when I go into church or I'm at the unity group or, these different groups of people who have kind of a quasi-mix, multicultural religious field, that there's a lot of sattva in the space. Because they are at that transition where as human beings, they're developing those qualities that align them. But that's not necessarily spiritual awakening. You can have a lovely sense of God when you go to church. You can have a lovely sense of community. You can feel like you're being devout or you're being good when you follow the principles. You can go into the monastery and you can spend time and span that quality in yourself that's capable of moving into relationship with the truth of you that you are. But the tendency of the consciousness is it's still embedded, still invested, still lost. God is still lost in a refined aspect of the mind, vital, and body, but it's still bound. Therefore, it's not stable. Therefore, our ability to access our relationship with God will pretty much stay in a semi-static range. We'll have periods where we'll feel connected and we'll go to church and we'll feel really committed and involved. That'll fade away and we'll lose interest and we'll get caught back up into our life. And what comes out of it is we get back into the community and then we feel supported enough so that we feel better than we were. And by staying connected to that, then you can pretty much have this relatively happier relationship with existence as a human being. So they do this through the lay order of all religions, where a person is still a householder or in the world, or they do it through the more committed, the ministers, the priests, the monks that involve and commit themselves to that. But that's why, if without spiritual awakening, you can spend lifetimes in monasteries and not get awakened. Because the sattva soothes. It doesn't allow for the poignancy of our separation to become apparent enough. Not always. There are many who awaken or are in dejection. 40 years living in a monastery, no life. The only thing you got is the gruel you eat every day and working in the garden in the heat or the bugs or whatever. And you're just putting up with it. And there is this like, what the fuck am I doing? Nothing's really changing. And they get moments of despair. And in that particular case, the best use of that despair is throws them back into life. And then they get in trouble again. And then there they can really suffer. There they can really kind of get ready to wake up. So the 6th chapter is pointing to a stage in the journey where we're awakened and in a more dynamic and growing relationship with that divine principle that we are, that lives us. So the qualitative difference between someone who meditates because of a tradition that is not awakened and one who meditates who has truly awakened is night and day. One has rules and structures and practices. It has symbols. It has belief systems and rules. And the other is a spontaneous unfolding of direct experience. The spontaneous unfolding of direct experience is what makes us all capable of going beyond the 6th chapter. Because once we open up, wake up to that essential reality, what we are, that essential reality does not stop coming in. We may veil ourselves from it. We may ignore it. We may have to take some lifetimes before it can gather enough momentum to move us beyond. But it's a part of us that can then, from then on, see through the obscurity, see through the bullshit, see through the dogma and the creed and the rules and recognize truth. This is where I begin to have a role. Previous to this, and a lot of my work, especially in the broadcast, is to orient people, to educate people to the basic structure of the spiritual path, and to preparing those who are receptive to the possibility of aligning with those structures as their means of traversing the journey, moving into a deeper and more profound relationship of what they are. Really isn't about Satri or my particular teachings. It's really simply about them linking up to the force that becomes active in them when they hear me or when they listen to me or they hear about me, because then there's a recognition in them. So when there's a recognition in someone, when they listen to me, then I have a role in nurturing the unfolding of that quality of themselves that can recognize God and truth. Not the mind, not the story, not the compatibility with what you've known before, not the idea of what you thought it should look like, but the thing itself. Now, how many are able to come out of those things I just mentioned? Take away 100 people for every one who can get and trust that recognition. Everyone else has somebody they're loyal to or obligated to, or doubt or fear, or their inability to bring it into their lives, to live it, to make it real in some more tangible, satisfying way. So out of 101, maybe. And that one then is the one who's beginning to access this quality where in the awakening, the bud is opened. If the awakening is allowed to expand, it can become a blossom. But it takes this collaboration because the conditioning that we've inherited for hundreds of lifetimes, maybe thousands, maybe tens of thousands of lifetimes, is habituated to keeping ourselves from doing so. We lose a sense of identity. We become uncomfortable. We can't focus like Satchimai today. We become vulnerable. We become less confident. We become less sure of ourselves. We have less control over our personality. So the odds of you actually being able to align with this could easily take another 100, 1 out of 100. The 7th chapter is where the guru kicks in. The 7th chapter is when the universe starts talking to us. Now, there are people who don't consciously have a guru, but there is influences that have come in outside of the human domain of mind, emotion, and body, vital and body, that is helping the soul. And that may be a picture of Ganesh, or Kali that you recognize. You never actually meet a person who represents that, but that alignment with that recognition then begins to allow you to draw from that particular idea, right? God doesn't need an idea. The person needs an idea. The person needs an image. The person needs a picture. The person needs a principle in some sort that it can align itself with. And if left to itself in time, if one is able to organize themselves, they'll align themselves with whatever that idea may be. Maybe it's the idea of Christ. Maybe it's the idea of St. Francis of Assisi. Maybe it's the idea of Vishnu or Shiva. Maybe it's an idea of a teacher like Ramana or someone you've heard about or you read the books of, Nirgadada. Then in that process of the idea, something starts happening. And if one actually organizes themselves effectively, the thing that idea represents for the person, they attain. They can become Ramana. They can become Ramakrishna. They can become that quality of Vishnu that they can imagine. But it's still limited by what is capable, the person is capable of imagining in terms of its approximation of what we would call God itself, the principle itself that the Word of God is actually too limiting for. But it's the same principle that gets one to the place where Ganesh becomes a lived experience. It comes in your dreams. It assists you in the course of your life. Or Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, they become means through hearing about them that allows you to reorganize your life. Certainly, I went through that process before my awakening. And I've seen people who have been in that process because they didn't have a teacher that there was an affinity with, sufficient affinity with, or that they couldn't end up trusting the teacher that had the capacity to take them. Because once you take your idea and make it real, it's no longer the idea. It's the real thing, not the ideal thing. And it's the real thing that we actually have to learn to love. It's the real thing of the human being, that when we can see the divinity in a human being, that's evidence that we have found the divinity in ourselves. God is the creation. But he doesn't know he's the creation. He can only know he's the creation through each of us. And therefore, we can only know that proportional to how much we've been able to emerge out of the veiling and the distortions and the structures that are good or bad, Sattvic or Tamasic, that prevent us from recognizing that in our own experience. But if you listen to that in you that can recognize truth, and if you put your attention on that which you recognize, you build a link. You create a scaffolding for yourself. You build a channel that nurtures that principle of the embodied God within you, waking it up further, giving it arms and legs, giving it roots and branches and leaves. It becomes animated as you. Therefore, this thing of recognition starts becoming revelations. By the time you come to the 7th chapter, you're ready for revelation. Revelation is when that which was there all along, that you never saw before, you can now see. It shows itself in glimmers, bits and pieces. It's piercing the veil of the Maya, the habit of your embodiment as a person. And you're beginning to get momentary glimpses, and as the quality, a kind of gestalt of whatever it is at that moment you're attending to. These revelations are like lightning strikes. They set in motion a biochemical process in the body. They're like little catalysts that set in motion a process that's inherent in the cells of every body, because inherent in the cells of every body is God itself. And when those cells wake up, God itself wakes up in that cell. And the quality of God's energy in matter is enormous. So every time a cell we realize or recognize a rising issue, for example, very commonly we'll recognize that will begin to be revealed to us that which separates us from that which we're learning to align with. So every time something will show itself, some darkness, some obscurity, some unexamined assumption that you've been living, there is this release of energy in the seeing of it. That is God itself. And it sets in motion this acceleration in the process that begins to convert the vehicle that God was identified with before into a vehicle that is fully aware of the God that it is. So in the 7th chapter, a few souls, 1 in 100 and 1 in 1,000, there's different figures, relatively rare, where we begin to open up to universal forces. And they begin to take over the process that we had been conducting in our efforting to come out of our embodiment, conscious or unconscious. And we can begin to align ourselves to a track. And that will take us as far as the source of that universal force that you're able to access. How far you can go quite far, even if it's still an idea, as long as it's able to access that divine quality in you. But it will not be able to be fully embodied until you are able to link with someone who has woken up as the Lord, as themselves. Because then that becomes possible for us. And this is what the Krishna is sharing with Arjuna at this time. So the first thing he did at the end of the 6th chapter, of all the yogis, this is the last verse, 280. Of all the yogis, however, one who's ever linked with me in heart, and for me has love and faith, him I consider to be the greatest and most dear to me. He's not dear to him because it's Arjuna. Dear to him because he's awakening in that form. Krishna is seeing himself awakening in that form. Arjuna is not yet able to see himself in the Krishna. That doesn't come until the 11th chapter. But at this chapter, if that devotion is there, if that pool is there, if that longing and aspiration is there, then you have found your track. That's proof. And now what happens in the 7th chapter? In the 7th chapter, Krishna begins to reveal himself to Arjuna. He starts describing his universal nature. All beings are born from me and have these two natures, higher as spirit or soul, and lower as matter or prakriti. I am the source of all origin and all dissolution. Okay, now this isn't somebody talking. This is a revelation. This is a showing of a truth that it's God everywhere. It's all God. It's all truth. It's all love. There is nothing higher than this, nothing higher than me. As pearls are threaded in a string, so also all the worlds are held in me. I am the taste in water, light in the sun and the moon, the sacred Om in the Vedas, sound in ether, and manliness in men. And goes on to describe, I am the pure fragrance in the earth element, heat and light and fire, the life force in all beings, and the aesthetic force in men of austerity. These are all revelations. They're all felt viscerally. They are all known as truth when they come to you. This isn't just some guy proselytizing. It is a revelationary experience that's starting to occur in the soul at this stage, that's preparing itself for what will occur later. I thought I would read this part because I don't think I've gone over this that much, because at this point, I'm telling you, the soul has an idea or an ideal, someone living or a principle that it's organized itself around to be able to get from the 6th chapter to this chapter. So now he's speaking about the nature of what unfolds with a person at this stage. After many births, the Jnani attains my true state and realizes that Vasudeva, the omnipresent being, is all. Such a great soul is indeed a rare devotee and difficult to find. So this is one who has had at least a momentary experience of the interconnectedness of it all, that it experiences its relationship with the creation, that there is a God within me and there's a God without me, and that are all interconnected. This is the state of Vasudeva. This is the state confirms for us in our own experience the reality that's unfolding in us, so that when we look outward as well as when we look inward, we find the same quality. But, he says in the next verse, when this wisdom is carried away by desire, one begins to worship other deities according to one's nature of faith and follows the rules of such worship. So we can only have faith in that we can imagine. We only can have faith in that has been organized in us in such a way that we can recognize it when it comes. Otherwise, we'll have faith in that which we can recognize. And what we can recognize is going to be the same thing, but a lesser or partial expression. So we will, by that quality, be able to attain that partial expression. But right at this point, Krishna is saying, that's not the whole picture. That is because there's still some desire. There's still some ambition. There is still some wanting. There's still some demand or need from our human life that's limiting the full expression of what's trying to reveal itself. But however, he says, whatever may be the deity that a devotee worships for fulfillment of these desires, I stabilize the faith of the devotee on that deity. It's not that Krishna does this. It is not like he sacrifices his devotee for some other devotee. That's not it. It means that anyone who sincerely and with commitment aligns their attention to that principle, will get that principle. Due to this strong faith, the devotee receives the desired object from that deity as ordained by me. Now, this could be a city. It could be able to feel connection. It could be the city of oneness. It could be the city of knowing the Brahman. It could be continuous bliss in your meditation. It could be any one of these as partial expression, experiential expressions, or mental quieting, a silent mind, and the peace that comes in that silence. These would be where a person at this stage would tend to rest, would tend to say, okay, this is enough. I can take this little treasure and I can spend the rest of this life milking this one for all I can get. However, next verse 303, he says, these fruits gained by people of narrow understanding are all transitory. That means they all come and go. You have to use the technique. You have to use the method. Otherwise, it goes away. So there is this coming and going and coming and going. And that's an inevitable part of the journey. But he's pointing to something that doesn't come and go. Though that might not be apparent to one at this stage. It wasn't apparent to me when I came to India, and when these experiences were happening, I just wanted the experiences. I mean, they're better than any drug, no hangover, No, you could just enjoy them and then it'll go away quiet. Well, that's how everything else in existence had up to now. And this was really free. And I didn't need anybody or anything, just to sit quiet and just let it happen. Just be in the enjoyment of that spiritual enjoyment of it all, right? But it doesn't go anywhere because we keep pulling ourselves back to that preferred experience. We keep pulling ourselves back to that preferred ideal rather than going beyond that. So the ego tends to stabilize itself at that place and becomes even more unwilling to go further. So this is the Sattvic ego. And I encounter much of this. It's very hard for people to see that coming to me is better than what they already have. Right? A bird in hand is better than two in bush. So there is this, why don't we have faith when the revelation says this is something greater? Is because of that quality in ourselves, that our faith has not yet been able to expand to the full recognition outside of your ideals. Now, for me, I didn't have any ideal until my awakening. I didn't even have an ideal even when I went to India. I kept putting this form here and that form there and that ideal there and that ideal, and they all worked. So I didn't have any one particular ideal. So it was easier for me to go beyond that veil, beyond that image, beyond that story, in order for this to continue to proceed, because the 7th chapter is just the beginning of the next 2/3 of the Gita. It's the beginning of this entry field of this unspeakable love affair that comes from the reunion of God and embodied in God and always free. The worshipers of gods go to the godly plane. But my devotees, by whatever method they may worship me, attain me. So my devotees, who are my devotees? Those are one who recognize the divinity that's within them, in the teacher, in me. When they recognize it within their whole being, then their faith now can take them as far as that recognition, which means they can become whatever the teacher carries. This is true for teachers at varying states. When our mechanism that allows us to recognize God or truth, love, that quality of the awakened ability to know, it's valid. It is in its essence always going to be ultimately for that supreme principle, no matter what form we put in there that shows up as the object of our faith. For me, it occurred when I watched my teacher on the video talk of the soul. When I saw him talk on the soul, the recognition on that video in my office, my basement office, sometime in early 1998, the recognition was almost complete. And I knew in that moment that whatever it is that had come to him was the same as what was trying to come in me. It was the recognition that that person, that form, was the track for me to be able to embody what was trying to embody itself at the beginning. So this is, when that comes, that grace, then you're going to be most dear. You're going to be the most dear. Krishna fell in love with Arjuna at that moment. God became intoxicated with the form that carries him. And so that's the beginning of the love affair. It's the beginning of the next stage of the dynamic, transformative opportunity of the spiritual path that the Gita points to. All right. There you have it. Pretty cool. It's good to have correct understanding. There is no real separation except in our own minds. There's actually no other person that has to work things out but us. We only have to be responsible for what in us is not in a true relationship with the world and with God. Nobody else. When we can let go of that habit of thinking and sensing and experiencing, where it all goes outward, and we can discover that the problem lies in my own inability to be in a direct and immediate relationship with the reality that lives me. And then what happens is this unfolding of a self-evident truth that you can never lose, that never goes away, was never born. Even though you're a person that has had a birth and will have a death, who goes through all these experiences, this principle becomes accessible to you in all aspects of your life. And you live life from that place. And this is what transforms the world. It transforms you. It transforms those who are linked to you. It transforms those who come to you. And it transforms the world because God has become fulfilled in that one form. And that's the possibility for all of you. And that is the work I do. Who am I working for? I'm working for my lover. I'm working for the most precious and magnificent thing. And that's each of you, even if you don't know it yet. And the more you know it, the more easy and the more wonderful it is for me to be with you. And therefore, you become more dear. Hmm. Yeah. So, how are we doing? Yeah, let's meditate. So 15 minutes. Hari Om Tat Sat. Hari Om Tat Sat. Hari Om Tat Sat Shri. All glory to Gurudev. Namaste.